Hari ini tepat 1 tahun pertama kali COVID-19 masuk ke Indonesia, yang ditandai dengan kehadiran kasus 01 dan 02 dari pasien di kawasan Depok, Jawa Barat. Sejak saat itu, kasus COVID-19 terus mendaki dengan infeksi yang terus menjadi-jadi. Krisis kesehatan pun tak terelakkan, berimbas pada krisis perekonomian, dan Indonesia dinilai gagal menangani COVID-19. Pada 1 Maret 2021, Indonesia berada di peringkat 18 kasus COVID-19 tertinggi di dunia. Sudah ada 1,3 juta kasus COVID-19 terkonfirmasi dengan penambahan 6.680 kasus harian. 1,15 kasus sembuh dan menyebabkan 36.000 jiwa meninggal dunia. Hingga kini vaksinasi terus digencarkan dan sudah mencapai tahap kedua. Selama 1 tahun COVID-19 menginfeksi raga Ibu Pertiwi, berbagai indikator ekonomi mencatat kontraksi terburuknya. IHSG terpangkas nyaris sepertiga dari nilainya, dari level tertinggi hampir 6.400 poin di bulan Januari, menjadi sedikit di bawah 4.000 poin pada pertengahan Maret 2020. Pertumbuhan ekonomi di 2020 pun minus 2,07%. Ratusan triliun dana pemulihan ekonomi pun terus dikucurkan.
Ya, saya kira itulah salah satu konsekuensi daripada menduanya sikap pemerintah. Jadi pemerintah itu melakukan kebijakan yang keseimbangan. Dalam era pandemi itu tidak ada keseimbangan ekonomi dan kesehatan. Yang adalah prioritas. Prioritasnya adalah menekan penularan. Kalau kita berhasil menekan penularan, walaupun berdampak terhadap melumpuhnya ekonomi, itu bersifat sementara. Tetapi apa yang terjadi di Indonesia? Yang terjadi adalah kita belum berhasil mengatasi penularan. Akhirnya ekonomi kita juga tidak berhasil dipulihkan.
Saya rasa ini 1 tahun yang sangat berat bagi banyak pelaku usaha. Hampir semua sektor itu terdampak. Mungkin hanya sektor yang berhubungan dengan informasi teknologi maupun kesehatan yang sedikit ada positif ya. Tapi hampir sebagian besar itu pasti terkena dampaknya. Nah, kalau kami lihat dari evaluasi kami selama 1 tahun, kami juga sudah jelas bahwa tanpa adanya pengendalian pandemi COVID-19 itu tidak mungkin ekonomi kita bisa dipulihkan. Jadi recovery ekonomi akan sulit.
Tepat 1 tahun pula COVID-19 menyerang Indonesia, kini ada kado pahit datang, yaitu kehadiran mutasi B117 yang berasal dari Inggris di tanah air. Wakil Menteri Kesehatan Dante Saxono Harbuwono mengatakan Indonesia akan kembali menghadapi pandemi COVID-19 dengan tingkat kesulitan yang semakin berat.
Dari 1 tahun kita melakukan refleksi. Kalau 1 tahun yang lalu kita menemukan kasus 01 dan 02 COVID-19, tadi malam saya mendapatkan informasi bahwa dalam tepat 1 tahun hari ini kita menemukan mutasi B117 UK mutation di Indonesia. Ini fresh from the open, baru tadi malam ditemukan 2 kasus.
Dengan nama silsilah B117, varian baru itu diduga sudah ada sejak September 2020 di wilayah Kent, Inggris. Strain baru ini disebut 70% lebih menular dari tipe SARS-CoV-2 yang sudah ada sebelumnya. Selain gejala umum COVID-19 seperti demam, batuk kering, dan hilangnya indera perasa dan penciuman, gejala varian baru ini seperti kelelahan, nyeri otot, ruam kulit, kebingungan, hingga kehilangan selera makan. Kasus corona pun melonjak tajam di Inggris. Data dari Worldometers menunjukkan saat ini 4,18 juta warga Inggris terinfeksi dan mencatatkan 122.000 kematian. Sementara itu, Menteri Riset dan Teknologi menilai vaksin bukan segala-galanya untuk akhir pandemi, lantaran dibutuhkan penelitian mendalam untuk mengenali karakter virus untuk mengatasinya. Selain itu, karenanya virus ini mudah menular, harus ada alat testing dan screening yang didatangkan lewat impor, lantaran Indonesia belum bisa memproduksinya. Namun Satuan Tugas Penanganan COVID-19 masih optimistis Indonesia bisa terbebas dari corona bila menerapkan pemberlakuan pembatasan kegiatan masyarakat secara mikro atau PPKM. Realisasi kebijakan ini telah menekan penambahan kasus konfirmasi dalam beberapa pekan terakhir.
Dan desa serta kelurahan ini harus mengedepankan pendekatan penanganan lewat RT dan RW. Kalau kepemimpinan di tingkat RT dan RW ini baik, maka akan lebih banyak lagi RT-RT yang zonanya hijau. Kalau RT zona hijau, RW hijau, desa dan kelurahan hijau, dan ditarik ke atas semuanya bersama-sama untuk mengendalikan, mudah-mudahan pada ulang tahun perayaan kemerdekaan bangsa kita bisa mengendalikan COVID ini dengan lebih baik, mengurangi angka yang terpapar COVID, dan juga mengurangi angka kematian.
Akhir dari pandemi COVID-19 masih samar, lantaran hingga saat ini, Indonesia masih berjibaku untuk melawan musuh tak kasat mata ini. Tak hanya Indonesia, negara lain pun masih menjadi pesakitan, meniti jalan panjang berjuang lepas dari jeratan corona. Dan selama corona mendera, ekonomi masih akan sengsara.
Kita kembali bersama dengan Adam Schwarz di dalam program Impact, CEO dari Asia Group Advisors, dan juga seperti saya katakan tadi adalah sebuah penulis atau seorang penulis atau penulis daripada sebuah buku, A Nation in Waiting. Adam, this region has changed. Indonesia has changed. The prospects of Indonesia and the prospects of the region. But before we go there, journalists tend to have a negative impression about Indonesia very often. Yeah, we have seen that most of the journalists that have written in the past are actually wrong. You know, their prediction was that Indonesia is going to fall apart, that Indonesia will become a totally catastrophe. But we have seen that Indonesia has actually overcome many difficult periods. One of the periods, or one of the economic problems that Indonesia have overcome was the 2008 financial crisis. How did you see and what did you expect Indonesia to overcome this problem at that time? And what is it that Indonesia actually made Indonesia having been able to overcome the problems that it was?
Well, in some ways, you wouldn't ask for it, but I think the experience of the Asian financial crisis 10 years earlier sort of was the real shock to the system.
What happened between 1998 and 2008?
Well, there was a whole bunch of financial sector reforms in response to the Asian financial crisis. So, third-party lending, there was too much exposure into banks that were owned by conglomerates. The prudential job that the central bank sometimes was influenced by politics. There was probably, you could make a case, there were maybe too many banks when they opened up the banking sector. So there were a number of structural issues.
Marlin.
among others, yes. I mean, I think there was oftentimes Pacto was one of the deregulated Pacto. It was very busy back then, right? Sort of in some ways a precursor of the omnibus law, which I'm sure we'll get to in a minute. But I think sometimes you had that big crisis in '98, and then there was in some ways Indian banks hadn't really recovered that much by 2008, right? Sort of loan to deposit ratios were much lower. So actually the banking system wasn't nearly as vulnerable as it was in 1998, and so I think in that sense it was better able to just weather the storm.
In 1998, when the financial crisis started in Thailand, and it was then I think followed by Korea, and then after Korea we had even Japan coming into the picture,
right.
And then Indonesia being the last part of the crisis and basically the worst hit.
Right.
What do you think the Indonesian government and the leaders did? What did they do at that time to overcome such a huge problem that they were facing?
Well, there was a little bit. First of all, so yes, so I think it was May 1997 when the Thai baht was the first to go. And then it could have surprised everybody. So instantly the financial markets were taken by surprise, and then they just assumed that everything was a problem. Of course, there were a lot of problems, and Indonesia was different a little bit from Korea, Malaysia, and Thailand in the sense that it was sort of a dual shock. It was both an economic shock and
a political shock.
Pastor was reelected in March 1998, but by May or June he was out of power. So, you had a
in May he was out of
May,
power.
Right?
May 13th,
or around that week, right? So you had a president been in power for 32 years leaving with, and often is the case when you have a long-term authoritarian regime like that, you don't really have anything to fill the void. It takes a while to build that. And so you had that political shock and the economic shock happening at the same time. And I think that really fundamentally explains why Indonesia both had the worst experience in terms of GDP growth in '98 compared to the others, but also took longer to kind of get back to where they were in early '97.
Would you say that Indonesians are resilient?
Was what?
Resilient.
I would. I think it's a very difficult thing to do, to sort of go from one system that's been entrenched for a long, long time, that's, quite personal, as authoritarian regimes are, to go to, not really, a managed democracy, to use a Sukarno term, but actually a quite liberal democracy with very broad elections and across a very large geography. Obviously it's been a rocky road, there's been back and forth, but, 20 years is not that long in sort of political history terms. And here we are 20 years later, 22, 23 years later. I think if you were 20 years ago, if we were having this conversation, and you said, all right, 20 years from now, which country of ASEAN, of the 10 members of ASEAN, is going to be the most stable, robust democracy in ASEAN? I'm not sure you get a lot of people to pick Indonesia, but in fact, that is the right answer.
What would you say about Indonesia being a country where the people actually in 1945 were not giving their freedom? They were not giving their independence by the Dutch. They fought for their independence. Yeah. Then in 1958, they actually asked the Dutch to leave, and they nationalized all the assets. In 1965, we had the big communist coup d'etat, or the coup d'etat, or the communist, what do you call it, communist, I wouldn't say debacle, but it's a communist event, rather. Then we have so many, during the year 1965 until the year 1998, there were many devaluations of the rupiah. There were many crises that they have overcome. And in 1998, again, they overcome one of the biggest crises in the history of Indonesia. People are willing to work together? People are smart enough? Or is it outside powers that have actually steered Indonesia into the direction which they are in today?
Oh no, I think this is largely an internal story. This is an Indonesian story, an Indonesian drama, whatever you want to call it. Obviously, there's outside powers that influence it.
13,000 islands, many different religions, right, many ethnic groups, yet they are able to overcome.
Yet they're able to overcome. I mean, obviously, in the very first couple of years after Schwarz stepped down, there were some regional clashes, and a lot of things had been bottled up for a long time. But I think the lesson that everybody took from that is that those were largely local, and then they were resolved, and the country has held together. As I said, even prior in the 80s and 90s, I was always struck by how strong a sense of national identity there is. That's why I didn't think the Yugoslavia example was that compelling.
Yet, very often, foreign agencies or foreign rating agencies, they give ratings to countries, especially and Indonesia, triple C minus, triple C plus. I don't know. They go to B and to A, but then they were actually rating Indonesia as a country that had no hope at that point in time. In 2008, we saw that most of the American companies, you had Enron, you had even Arthur Andersen, you had Citibank, you had all the big companies, Lehman Brothers, what have you, American insurance companies, all being rated AAA, and yet they all fell apart. How do these rating agencies, how do you look at these rating agencies?
Well, I think it'd be hard to argue with the sentence.
It's hard to argue?
No, I'm saying it'd be hard to argue against the point that rating agencies did not come out well in 2008. And that
only in 2008?
Well, I think people in the industry like yourself, you probably suspected it long before. But I think certainly in 2008, and the aftermath of that, people realized that the rating agencies were a little bit too close to the companies that they were rating, and it wasn't that independent. And as it came to sort of foreign countries, there was just sort of a drop-off in knowledge and understanding. I mean, it probably also to be said, particularly before Reformasi, I think the government of Indonesia did not do as well as some other countries in communicating economic reforms, what it was doing, and so it was a little bit of a guessing game, and that doesn't help, right?
So rating agencies are not always or most of the time right or wrong?
Well, you're closer to that business than I am. I think everybody now takes ratings with a little bit of a grain of salt, right?
2008, 2023 today, the region. But before we talk about Indonesia, how do you see the region developing? How do you see the economic development in the region? We have China, we have Korea, we have even Vietnam, we have Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. How do you see this? How do you see this region? 65% of the total population in the world are in Asia.
Yeah.
How do you see this region?
This is the Asian century, right? I think it depends on sort of how high above the forest you want to look, but this is clearly the center of global growth it has been and will be for the foreseeable future. Obviously, there's caveats. Of course, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. We have U.S.-China rivalry. No one quite knows where that's going to go. So there's always these exogenous events that you have to, sometimes you can predict, sometimes you can't. But the intrinsics of Asia, in terms of the demographics, in terms of the location, in terms of the education, in terms of the natural resource base, all point in very positive directions. And I think, my own view is that Southeast Asia is particularly well positioned at the moment. I think it's going to be a net beneficiary of kind of where the U.S.-China relationship is going.
How do you see where is it going?
It's going to get
Crystal ball?
It's going to get more competitive rather than less competitive.
Competitive?
Competitive.
In a positive or more towards threatening each other?
I think that depends
and
a lot.
Going into the Third World War.
I think it depends a lot on the leadership of both sides. I think it could go either way, to be honest with you. I think right now, I think people feel it's a little bit more stable. I think with President Trump in office, people were more worried just because it was a more unpredictable, erratic foreign policy, to put it that way, maybe too kindly. I think there's sort of more, there'll be a little bit more depth in the relationship now. But the two countries, what has changed in the U.S. is that the view that China was going to become, in some ways, more like the U.S., that's gone. China is now seen as a rival, and it's a matter of how that rivalry gets managed. In my view, going back to the Southeast Asia point, as long as that rivalry is managed and doesn't get out of control, Southeast Asia should be well positioned to benefit from it.
How do you see in ASEAN countries vis-a-vis the U.S. and China?
Well, I think in some ways they're going to be sought after by both. Right? Both China and the U.S. would like to have, I suppose neither big power would like to see ASEAN swing to the other side. And so...
Who has a bigger chance?
Who's got a bigger challenge? I think the U.S. Further away, among other reasons. But, China, listen.
What should the U.S. do?
I think the U.S. needs to have a stronger... economic posture in its foreign policy. So in its Indo-Pacific strategy, I've used this line before, but sort of when China and the U.S. senior government officials visit ASEAN countries, including Indonesia, they all tend to talk about the same three things: security, politics, and economics. Chinese tend to talk about economics, then politics, then security, and the Americans tend to talk about it in the other order. And generally speaking, the ASEAN countries prefer the Chinese order. They want the conversation to be focused on economics.
By the way, you are a member of the American-U.S. Chamber of Commerce, right?
I am. Yeah. Yes, I am. And
is this being discussed?
I think businesses.
Do you advise them?
I don't advise the chamber. No.
You don't. Will you advise them? You are a speaker in many forums.
Yeah.
I've seen that you are very active in actually bringing to America the news about Asia.
Yeah.
And what you said just now, security first, economic last, and the other way around from the Chinese, economic first and security last. Will you advise the U.S. that this is probably the sequence that they should be looking at?
Listen, as you say, it's a free market of ideas out there. I've expressed this view. I think the U.S. government has attempted to build out the economic side, but frankly, it hasn't made a huge amount of progress, right? So
are they busy with themselves?
They're very domestic focused, and I think that's going to stay the same. You know, there's a risk in highly nationalist policies that, you know, America first, to use the Trump phrase, that, you know, that if that goes wrong, that becomes more like America alone, right? So, you know, I think in a number of years, when people look back at this region and sort of how other large countries have handled it, they will look at, for example, to take one example, the U.S. decision to withdraw from the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in 2017, and India's decision last year to not go forward with RCEP as large strategic errors, right? In the sense of sort of ceding the economic integration territory, so to speak, in the fastest growing economy of the globe to China.
Before we take the break, just one last question. Before we talk about Indonesia per se, because you have been here for a week now, and I would like to know what your activities are. But before we take the break, the South China Sea.
That's a principal area of contention, both between the claimant states and China, but also a divisive issue within ASEAN.
How do you think? How will you see America trying to play a role in the South China Sea?
I think America, and not America alone, are going to do what they can to try to protect the freedom of navigation in open seas and waters.
That's the freedom of navigation. Are they worried that the Chinese will actually hamper the freedom of navigation? Is that what they're worried about?
I think part of it.
Why should the Chinese hamper navigation in the South China Sea?
Listen, I think the view is that because of the claims that inherent in the 9-dash line are, you know, I think the thinking is if that's a violation of international law, which international courts have deemed it is, then the other violations are possible. I think that's the thinking.
We'll take a break. Pemirsa, kita masih berbincang dengan Adam Schwarz, seorang yang sangat saya hormati, CEO dari Asia Group Advisors. Kita akan kembali bersama dengan Adam Schwarz setelah jeda beberapa iklan ini, dan kita akan berbicara mengenai prospek Indonesia ke depan dan hubungan Indonesia dengan Amerika khususnya. Tetaplah bersama kita di program Impact.